Welcome to my next video in my fabric fodder series. Now this video is going over using paint on dry fabrics, and I'll be showing you several techniques, several ideas of how you can use paint on a dry fabric to create usually a background, or you may be adding details over the top of some other technique. What we're doing right now is starting the foundation for the different techniques that you can use on your fabric fodder. You got to start at the base and understand those techniques before you can take off and fly with some of the wilder, crazier, and frankly more interesting ones. But you have to build the foundation, and what we're doing with these early techniques is just getting the feel for how fabric paints work and how you can kind of adjust what you may have or find what you may want to add to your toolbox in order to have your best results. It has been an amazing week with the number of people who have been excited to learn about these techniques, and I am super excited to share with you what I do know and what I have learned over the past 50 years. I don't feel this old, but anyway, again, if there's a specific artist that I am using a technique that they developed, by all means, I will name them. And I appreciate everybody's liking my video, subscribing, and hitting the bell icon. I'm not used to saying that. You know, for all the years that I've been doing videos, I have not talked about, follow me, like my video, get alerts to when I post a new one. But as my son told me, Mom, there is these algorithm things that you kind of got to work with. So that's what I'm doing. So make sure you like, you subscribe, and you hit that little bell, because that will alert you when I put a new video up. Now, like this weekend, I put up the first video on Friday, and then I'm adding subsequent videos. There may be some times where I just put a single video up, but with this one, because we're laying the foundation, there's multiple videos. I'm also going to be using a lot of this fodder that we're creating in order to make actual projects. And as I get those done, I'll be showing those to you as well. So I'm glad you're all enjoying it. It is so exciting, again, that so many people are enjoying using fabric and wanting to play with it, whether it's to use in your mixed media or in your quilting or whatever you want to use it in. I'm excited to be sharing what I know with you, and I'm super excited to have you all on board. So stay tuned for the video. Thanks a bunch. French, so I can't pronounce this stuff. But it's a warm gray, and then and that's a tube acrylic. I've got golden Quin Azo gold. Now this one has been the Quin Nickel Azo gold has recently just been replaced, so now it's called Azo gold. It's very similar in color, but they had to replace it, do some availability of materials. And then I also added a little bit of titanium buff in the high flow. So we'll go ahead and mix those together. I'm going to use kind of one of my little rattier brushes, because I'm going to kind of create a background with this that I want to be kind of a dry brushy look. So we'll go ahead and mix that up, add other colors. I want it a little bit lighter, helps to open the bottle. And then I'm going to add some of my GAC 900 medium, or whatever medium you are using. I had the lid off earlier, so I just made a mess a little bit. There we go. Now they do recommend in the 50-50 ratio. I tend to go a little bit less. Just, I don't know why, I just do. I tend to prefer it to be a little drier type, but that's about, well, maybe a little bit more gray to that. A little, I know I'm off on the edge of the camera. trying to keep where I'm going to paint in the middle. So yeah, that's a little grayer. That's more like what I want. Doesn't have to be super mixed up. So I'm just going to do almost like a dry brush. Since I'm using dry fabric, I want to take advantage of that and just kind of give it some, maybe a little more over on this side. Again, these are not finished pieces. These are going to be for pieces that we're going to use to create another project. So, and then I'm going to, as an accent, and I'm going to want that to dry a little bit. I should have brought my my blow dryer down to let this dry. The stuff really dries relatively quickly. But I'm going to use some, what's this one? This is Amsterdam. It's greenish yellow. I love this color. It's really, truly one of my faves. But the biggest thing at this point, we're just kind of playing. And I just want this accent color on there. Maybe I'll add a little bit of this one to it too, just to tone it down just a little bit, so that we can then create a little more neutralized, not so chromium kind of green. Now I'm just going to do some bars of this color. One down here, because so then this has the potential to be maybe a focal piece on a bag or a little tote or a little pouch. Because what I'm thinking of doing with all these sample things, I'm going to start putting together some pouches and such to use these on. Since I have so much of this green, just run this down the side. And then I have a cool copper color. And then, as I said, remember, this is not a finished piece, but you might have something kind of an idea in your head, which is kind of where I'm at. And I'm going to be doing some stitching and adding some other bits on there. But I do want some of this copper color. It's just a metallic, a Deco Art copper. I want to throw some of that on there. And flick some of the copper onto it. So putting the medium in there kind of thins it down. That makes it nice and easy to do. Just some flicks. It's a little bit thick. I had too much paint on the brush, so just some little bits of flick just to bring that metallic in. And what I might be doing with this one is then using some metallic copper thread on it. So the thing with doing painted fabrics and stuff, it's not that immediate kind of, oh, I just keep going with it, unless you're ready to, after you got to let it dry. And then once it dries, you move on to, for instance, with mine, I layer them up with some batting and start sewing on them, or I start piecing with them. So it's not always a case of getting immediately to move on to the next step. You kind of have, it kind of slows you down a bit, which sometimes once my brain gets going, I kind of need that slow things down a little bit. So go ahead and let this one, I'll set it off to the side here to dry, and we'll work on another one. Now, you can work on solids, but you can also work on printed fabrics. Now this is a Fido fabric, Fido, F-I-D-O. It's one of the newer fabric lines that wasn't around when I was quilting previously. But it's got some typography on it. It's like almost like handwritten script on there, so that you can use that then to also paint on top of. So I'm just going to take some paper towel and wipe my palette off. Wipe this brush off. Some of these times, ones that I really like them when they look a little nasty, is I just kind of wipe the paint off of them rather than washing them. And that's how they kind of get dried and all nasty. So oftentimes what I do. Okay, so I guess kind of while that's still wet, just wipe that off. Toss that in the trash, and then I've got a relatively clean palette to do a different color on here. How about some pink with the gray? And this is just, again, some Amsterdam and a pink. I might throw a little hot pink with some high flow in there just to pop the color up a little bit. Let's make sure this one's open. I suspected that was the case. I had to buy another one of these because I'd used mine up. Just a touch of the fluorescent just to give it a little bit more of a pop. So let's use a little bit smaller brush for this one. And then throw our medium in there. And that gives a yummy, yummy kind of much more violet-y pink by mixing those two in. And this one, I'm just going to make some circles. Now, with a darker background, depending on the paint that you use, you may have them be a little more transparent, like these are, and I kind of like that. Or you may find you will want to add a second coat on there if you want to make sure that your whatever it is you're painting on there is in a is much more of an opaque. Like this one, as it's drying, it's getting much more transparent, so I can add some more onto it to give it. I should have pressed this one a little better. I didn't have any steam in my iron, and so it's not pressed super great. So just to give it a little bit more opaqueness, I'll go with a second coat over it. And it really many times does depend on your paint in that the transparency level of it. Now, fabric paints, I have found, versus the acrylics, I have found have potentially a little bit more opaqueness to them. They are more limited in colors, so unless you're comfortable with mixing colors, you'll be a little bit more limited. But with using just regular acrylic, some, as I know, especially with like golden paints, they give you a transparency. Like this is the Azo Golden, the tube form. It's pretty transparent, but you may have some, for instance, like this one is much more opaque. So you can look for the more transparent or more opaque when you're working on darker fabrics. I just many times do like what I'm doing right here is just giving it another coat. So I'm going to go now with a slightly different color to show that on the gray. Let's see. What color do I want to do? Let's go with a yellow. I like a yellow. This is a little bit green to it. This is a nickel titan yellow, again in the Amsterdam. And most of them will tell you on the better quality, they'll kind of tell you the transparency level. Like I think that's what those three. Let's see. No, maybe that's not what it is. Oh, it's the little square. For instance, on these, that little square shows it's opaque, whereas a little half square oops, I'm not on camera. That little square, half square, shows that it is a little more transparent, whereas the solid square shows it's a little bit more opaque. And also, when I want something to be opaque, maybe use a little bit less of your medium. And I apologize. Maybe I'll move this over a little bit so this is more on camera. As I said before, my I'm more into the creative side of things than the production side of things. And so as a result, some things aren't as perfectly planned. There's a little pink on my brush, but that's fine. It'll mix all in and just tint it just slightly. It'll just gray it down a little bit, which is fine. Okay, so maybe I'm gonna do, that's a little bit much, some pluses now with this. Because again, I'm probably gonna cut this up and use these pieces. And I like, for those little pieces and things, I like using some of the kind of graffiti-like kind of, oh, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not, I was going to say it's more, no, that's not the right word. Oh, well. Just kind of the more loosey-goosey. But this one, if I wasn't putting the medium in it, it probably would be much more opaque. Now, because most of my stuff that I do is not being used in a quilt per se, that you're going to use, or it's not being used on garments. And so the paint's a little stiff. It really doesn't bother me because I don't mind that. So there, I've now created off of this gray, I've now got another fabric that we can cut up and use in a project. So let me set this aside and let this dry. All right, for this next one, now with these pieces, I have taken my fat eighths and I've cut those in half horizontally. So these are about 9 by 11. So this is almost like having a sheet of paper, because my plan on some of these is to do some shorter, or not shorter, smaller type quilts that I'm putting into a book. So I'm not needing a significant amount. And if I decide I want some more, I can paint something similar to use into a different project. So let's go ahead and, again, I'm going to get a stand for my paper towels, wipe this off. For expedience sake, doing it that way rather than going and washing it off. Okay, now for this one, I want to talk a little bit about using that transparency. So I'm going to paint something on here first. That I want kind of a yellow, something that's a little more green. Oh no, let's go with a kind of a coppery color. So kind of a golden and then a kind of a copper, because then I'm going to take and do a turquoisey kind of transparent swoop over it. So let's go with some of that. And I want to tone these down. So I'm going to use, the Titan Buff again, just to throw a little in there, just to tone those a little bit. And I'm going to use that same kind of icky brush that's still got some neutral tone on it. So I'm just going to make a bit that's a little roughly striped. I always, some days when I'm painting, I just kind of just go with whatever strikes me. Sometimes I have kind of an idea in the back of my head, not super, I tend to try not to do it super literal, super refined idea unless I'm having something very specific that I'm doing. But I have a general idea of what I want this to look like. And so I'm just kind of going with that flow. Okay, so there's that done. So I'm going to let this dry for a minute while I do one other one. And then I'm going to paint some transparency over the top of this one. So let me set this one off to dry. And with this one, I am going to use a little bit, this is just a scrap of some, oh, let's see, is it charmeuse? I can never remember the kinds of fabrics. I should know all this, but that's stretching my brain back a lot of years. Remembering but it's a transparent kind of fabric. It's in a polyester. It's not a silk. So I don't recall exactly what it is, but I just know it's when you're cutting clothing out of it and stitching on it, it's a booger. So that's the big thing I will say about that one. And let's see, I'm going to use like a dark, this is like a charcoal. It's a super dark kind of charcoal. And I'm just going to make this one with some dots and stuff on it, some smallish dots, because this is a good one for using over the top of another fabric. I'm still frustrated. I can't come up with that word. It's at the tip of my tongue. This is what I hate about it when you start getting older, is trying to remember some of these. It's not coming to me, but just much more, and I know somebody will comment, give me all sorts of ideas in the comments, so. And just doing just some really basic, just dots. So it's probably not dissimilar to stuff that you may have done if you do art journaling kind of things. Let's do a little bit more. Now, one of the things I do want to remind you is I'm trying to kind of do a bit of a progression. I'm going to do some stripes here on this section. I'm trying to create kind of a progression. So normally, if I were doing this for myself, I would be combining all sorts of different techniques in order to create my my fabric fodder. But with this one, I'm just trying to stick true to the technique that I'm showing you, because once you know each technique, then you can start using them in tandems or groups to create what it is that you're wanting to create with your now on this one, this is a rayon fabric, and what I want to do with this one is I'm going to just create some just freeform, freely drawn flowers. So I'm going to use, this is light phthalo green. I just kind of love this pale little, this is one of my favorites. Now you can just use phthalo green and add white, but this is one of my favorites that I just absolutely love to use. So I tend to prefer just to go ahead and I just want a little bit of springy green, because we'll just turn that in. And then if I need a yellow, we'll bring that out for the centers. I can use some of this one. Now, doing dry fabric flowers, it's not quite like watercolor. When I show you doing this on wet fabric, you'll be able to see that. And it's much more watercolory on wet fabric. But we're just going to make some little flowers. We may want to do these to where they're much, this brush is really not working for me. It's a little too soft. Let's go with this one. Oops, not that one. That one just said, I want to do this. This one, the cats have been around because there's a cat hair hanging off of it. I wanted those to be a little more pointed. So. And again, we could do the exact same technique on a wet fabric, and it's going to kind of give you a different look. Okay, so then I might throw a little bit of this black in there, because I can, just to give it, along with this green, or this blue, just give me a little shadow kind of thing towards the center. You know, you may do flowers differently than I do. Totally fine. We all do things differently. Let's throw a little bit of this green in there. This has got more medium than paint. There we go. Now see, what I would do then on this is, because I'm really bad at lining with a brush, I would normally do like a pen or something to give some lines on those. Let's throw this little bit of green on, or yellow on there, so towards the center, especially while it's wet, so it kind of bleeds a little bit. There, so now that can sit and dry, and I can potentially add, you know, more to it, maybe just, so it's in this green, it's bright green. Just to throw some foliage in there, and then once it dries I can add more to it with either like a pen, or if you're good at lining with a brush, you can do that. So you can just draw something, you can paint something that's very specific. So let's go ahead and let this dry. Not going to be one that I will like, but okay, I'm going to throw a little of this yellow green in there because I don't want it quite so bright. And I'm also going to throw a little of the copper in there. Just this turquoise is a little more intense than I want. Come on, come off of there. And mix those up just to tone this. There we go. That's what I wanted. I wanted it more of a little rustier kind of looking. Throw some more of this because I want it to be pretty transparent. This brush is super soft. That's just going in the wash. let's see. Let's go with this one of these natural hair ones. And I want it to be a little more transparent. I kind of want, the brush is soaking everything up. I want it to be where, well, there you go. That one didn't work the way it's worked for me in the past, probably because it wasn't fully dry. And so it didn't come out quite as transparent as I would have liked. And so, you know what? Sometimes things that you're expecting work, sometimes they don't. So I'm just going to blot it kind of over that. Do a little, give the kind of look that I want. The big key is letting things dry properly. Because I'm in this format, I didn't let that dry quite as dry as it needed to be, but it does have some effect of the transparency over the top of the other. Not as much as I would have liked, but we'll make it work when we do some stitching and stuff like that on it. So let's go set this and let it to dry some more. All right, this next technique I want to show you is how you do something that's a little bit more controlled painting with the paints onto a dry surface. There's many ways of transferring it onto your fabric. You can draw it directly with a soft pencil. You can potentially draw it on the back of your freezer paper. And if you have a light enough background, many times you can see it. But one of the coolest things since I've come back into doing quilting stuff that I have discovered is using these Pilot friction pens, the erasable pens. They come in any number of colors, but using, just realized I didn't have this light on, but using these, you can draw on your fabric and then use your iron and it disappears. Now, I always suggest testing it. I haven't run into the problem, but I do know some of my students that I've had in the last year in my bag classes have had some issue with some of the colors not disappearing completely on the fabric they're using. So you always want to do a little test piece on an edge. Like there, I just scribbled, this is a black. And then I can bring my iron in and show you that when, I think this is hot. Yep. A little bit of heat, boom. It's like magic. It disappears. There used to be, and still is, some blue markers that would erase just with water, and most of us just spit on our quilts to remove it. But the problem with the blue pens is that if you got heat on them, it would set the ink in. Whereas with these, if you get heat on them, it disappears. So it's perfect for what we're doing is we're wanting to draw. So I'm going to draw some leaves that I will go ahead and paint. You can draw any shape. This just seemed like an easy shape that I could draw quickly while we're filming this. So I just go ahead and do that. Then I take my paints, and I've got my paints here in a multitude of colors. And so I can just paint right up. If you cover the line, it probably won't show anyway, but I can paint kind of right up to the line with a fine brush. And then when I go to heat set my project, once it's dry, those lines will disappear. Blend that in a bit. Touch of this up here at the end to give it a little brighter color. Maybe that's down the center. So you can just paint it, and you can see that line is still showing. But when we go to heat set this, once it's dry, that will disappear. It's the coolest thing. I love when you find out about magic. Now, how this probably came about is somebody might have marked something and they went to iron their fabric and discovered that their pen disappeared. But I'd rather have disappearing ink than ink I can't get out. So it's an exciting, whoever discovered it, I don't know. I certainly didn't. I got told about it. So now these paints I had already mixed them up with some medium and such. So we'll go ahead and just paint a little bit more. I'll just do these 3 and then I'll paint the other ones off camera and show you. At the end, I'm going to show you what all of these end up looking like when they're all dry. Old habits die hard. Since I used to do all of my videos where I didn't have, stops and starts because I didn't know how to edit. So those days, I now know the rudimentary amount of editing that I need to know so I can do stops and starts. That I didn't used to before. If I goofed up, I would have to go back in and totally redo the video. We grow and evolve, don't we? All right, so there's those 3 leaves that we'll go ahead and let dry. And then once they're dry, I'll demonstrate when I press it how that pen mark will poof disappear. It's cool. It's really cool. All right, I'm going to do the same sort of thing on this one where we can draw on it with the pen. This is kind of a, I don't know what to call it. It's a super lightweight fabric. I used to know all my fabrics when I would do clothing or back when I was in school, but I don't know. I just know this is a polyester versus a cotton, and it's one of those ones that's thin and transparent. So if you had something that you were layering it over, you could see the light and the dark underneath. So, but we can also draw. Let's draw some leaves on this as well, because maybe this is something we want to layer over what we've already, something maybe we already have going. So draw some leaves. Now I have this again fused onto some freezer paper just because it just makes it so much easier to paint when you're trying to do something detailed so that it stabilizes it, especially when it's a mushy gushy fabric like this one is. So again, now one of the things, if you're going to use those friction pens on something other than cotton, and I should have tested it on this, but I've already ironed this. Before you take any fabric and either fuse it with your freezer paper, or you're using the pens with the iron, is when you're using a polyester fabric, test a bit of it with your iron so that you don't melt it. Now we will, coming down the pike here of some of the things I'm going to be teaching, we will be doing some things where we want it to melt. So we're going to be doing some heated textiles to where we'll do some fun stuff with that too. But so you can just paint this stuff straight onto thinner fabrics or transparent type fabrics, and then your leaves come out not transparent, and so it kind of gives a neat effect. but having a pen that will disappear, because many times with pencil, even with a soft pencil, it doesn't show up quite as well. I like drawing on things with a pen like this because I can see it better. And then as you get it dry and everything, you have to heat set it anyway. And so it removes the pen then when you do that. Now it's a whole different animal if we were doing silks. There's all sorts of more fun things that you can do with silks too. But we're not really going to go into silk on this series. Silks with silk paints and dyes typically have a different heat set method than what you use on cottons. You can't just use your iron. It does need to be steamed. And that, I don't have that equipment anymore. I used to, but I don't any longer, to be able to steam yardage pieces of fabric. So anyway, all right, so again, we'll let this dry and come back and press it and show how those lines can just go poof, disappear. All right, I want to slip in here real quick now that these are dry and show you how we can have that pen now removed. Now, when there's paint on my fabric, I always want to make sure that I use some sort of press cloth. I just use a paper towel, to be perfectly honest, and that works great. Because if you press over, especially with acrylic paints, many times it'll stick to the bottom of your iron. So even those ones that are still drawn, by the time I lift this, it'll be like magic. Those pen lines are all gone. It's magic. You can see faintly down here, and if I do those, since those don't have paint on it, with the direct iron, the only thing I see here is the dent where it was drawn, but around our leaves, there's no pen lines. Do the same on this guy here. You can see the pen lines before. Always use a press cloth. Biggest thing I can tell you. And again, no pen lines, but we do have a barking dog. All right, so for this technique on the dry fabric, I'm going to be using my foam brush. And I kind of showed a little bit of a demonstration of this on the very first video, the basics video. But you can use, this is a large one. I seem to be missing all of my smaller, they tend to get snagged out of my supplies. But this one will work. And you can use this, it's almost more of a stamping method than a painting method. So I've got some black paint. I already got my medium in it. And so I'm just going to kind of dab it down. And this is a fun way to give kind of somewhat of a loose, depending on how you wiggle it and how much paint you have on it and how you place it. This is more of a stamping kind of technique than a brushing technique, but it's a fast way to create kind of a good backgroundy kind of pattern. You can also get it a little tighter on itself. This is an awesome one for doing, just giving yourself a cool background. And like I said, it's how much paint you have on there, how much you push it down. You know, that one I pushed it down a lot. Sometimes I don't. And so you can just kind of give a really nice background to use. And this is on a piece of tea-dyed muslin, so it's got a little bit of a tea-colored background to it. So then that just creates a really fun, cool background that you could cut it, you know, either vertically or horizontally, and would work in really well on some small pieces. And one of my tubes of paint. Let's see, what color do I want? Let's go with this because I like kind of those rusty colors. We're going to go with this transparent yellow oxide. And I'm going to go kind of right down the center. And I'm just going to take this one straight. And I'm just going to run a bead of it. If it misses a few spots, it's not a big deal. Again, this is that, and the word's still escaping me, but this is much more of a rustic kind of look. And so then I'm just going to take and brush that out on one side. Do it again on the other side. And then we can do another strip of it. And what I will often do is once I've done one and it dries, I'll do a contrasting color down the center of it and do it again, maybe in a little lesser amount. This one's also fun to do on the wet fabric. Maybe I'll show this one also on a wet fabric because it does it much slower. I've done this with watercolors myself as well. And it kind of makes for a cool effect. You don't want a huge amount. I'd rather have less than too much. Sharpen my camera here. Just give it quick flicks to brush it out. So again, when we let this dry, then I can also put maybe a darker color or something in a lesser quantity that I can flick out. Or I may take this piece and once it's dry, wet it down and do a little bit more of a wet technique over the top of it. In the next video, I'll be showing you more of some of those wet techniques and such. But anyway, we'll go ahead, once again, let this dry. This kind of painting on fabrics to create fodder is a lesson in patience, letting it dry, or you get your hair dryer out, whichever. I'm usually not terribly patient, so I tend to get the hair dryer out or the heat tool. But anyway, there's another one. All right, with this last one that I'm gonna do, I have mixed up just a pale kind of gray with some titanium white. I've added some Titan buff, and I've also added a few other colors. And now that I'm looking at it, I'm gonna need a little bit more than that. It's a delicate balance trying to figure out how much paint to mix, because fabric will suck up the paint a bit more than a paper or canvas will. Just putting a little bit of kind of rusty tones into it. That might have been a little bit much with that second I want kind of that corroded gray kind of look, so this will probably work. Yeah, that'll work. Now, this is showing you doing a light color on a dark background. When we did the darker backgrounds, we were doing a little bit brighter colors on it. So I want to do this with a light, and by using a titanium white as my base, because I know titanium white has a very opaque tone to it. So what I'm going to do with this is now I'm going to use a scraper. This happens to be one of the Catalyst scrapers, but you can use other things to scrape with, whether you have an old spatula, you have an old debit card, or Starbucks card or whatever. But you can use any kind of a tool that we're using to kind of scrape. So I'm just loading it up on the edge of this. It's not perfectly even, but this is an idea I have for the background I want. On the piece. So I've already had the idea that, oh, okay, I want a piece of light. Let's go ahead and turn this. I want something kind of light on this background, and I want kind of a area that I can use to do some other stuff on top of. Now, I have always liked using, you can even use a palette knife. I've always liked the effect of doing scraping paint on, because I like feathering it out. I like kind of that serendipitous kind of mushiness that happens like it did right there. Scrape some of this off with a palette knife so I can get all of it. Run this along this edge. Don't be afraid to just go with what it flows. I tend to, in most of my other work, I tend to be what could, I guess, be called anal. I like to have things planned out, and on some projects I do, but when I'm creating stuff like this is when I tend to just kind of let it loose and play a bit. Now I do want to have a place over here on the other side that kind of balances. So let's use what little I have left. Maybe do. Perfect. So then this is going to be potentially a background for a small quilt, and then I can collage and layer stuff on top of that area right there. But this is a relatively dark fabric, and then I've taken a relatively light paint over the top of it, and that's something that you can achieve. Now, one of the last little bits I'm going to show you is, as I said, doing mixed media, whether it's paper or fabric, turns you into a hoarder. Now, I had to make some bag samples for a shop that I'm teaching at next month, and it was using some of this netting stuff. And I spotted these pieces that I had trimmed off down in my trash. I pulled them out. So I'm going to go ahead and paint over them to make them look like more of a metallic. So I've taken some copper paint here, and it didn't get shaken up enough. It's more medium than paint. And I'm going to leave this full strength. And I'm just going to paint. And normally, when I'm painting something like this, I would put that over something, over a piece of fabric, so it becomes almost like a mask or a stencil. But it'll work onto my back, my drop cloth. Put some paint on that, on those little fabric-y end things, get some on there. And I don't know what I want these for, but I saw them in the garbage and I felt a compulsion to pull them out so that I can paint them. So, you know, this comes in yardage, so you could take and paint yardage of this netting too if you wanted to. Maybe I'll throw a little. Where's my favorite aquatone in there? I just used it. How can it be that far? Well, I don't know where it went, so we'll just use this. I literally was just using it. Isn't that weird how that happens? So I'm going to just throw a little. Like a little more of a corroded teal color to go on some spots of some of it. Give it that kind of corroded feel. Because copper tends to have more of a verdigris kind of coloration to it. My favorite green gold. It also has that corroded kind of color. So it can look like corroded copper mesh. So then, doesn't look like much, but when I layer it onto something, the colors will show when I'm actually using it. So those are just some little pieces that I can add on when I'm collaging some stuff. Also, whenever I tear fabric, which I tend to do a lot, there's also, you can throw some paint on to those, not super coat it unless you want to. I will be talking to you about how to paint and dye your flosses and stuff. We'll use a different paint for those and some dye. But these are great to use as little just wads. I don't know what else to call them on a project. So you got those little extra bonus. Let me see if I can grab one of my projects here that has some of that on there and show you what I'm talking about. Oh, this one shows it a little bit. There, I've taken some of these little threads that have been pulled from something, and I just couched them on. So that's why I tend to keep those. Throw a little paint on them. Just gives, again, here on this one, I use some of those loose threads underneath. This is a vintage sequin, so just to give a center on the flower. So, that's why I tend to hoard and keep all sorts of little things. But those are just little ways that you can add some bits and details. So don't throw anything away because you might be able to use it. All right, just a quick wrap up. Now that these have all dried, do a quick review of what we did today. So this first one where we did kind of a background and some green accent on there. I typically, when I'm just doing paint on dry fabric, most of the time when I'm doing that, it's to create a background more than it is to create, as I've said, this is not a finished product, but I use paint on dry more to create something that goes in the background. And then I typically will use multiple techniques, whether it's stenciling or masking or whatever, drawing on the top of whatever it is that I've created with the background. And we'll be doing that as we go along. The biggest thing with all of this is trying to restrain myself because I keep on to just keep going with other techniques. And I'm just trying to build kind of a a repertoire of techniques for you to use. So I'm really restraining myself and just, you know, keeping myself held back. So now that these are all dry, you can see how the color comes out on a gray background. This one came out a little bit as transparent as I was hoping. Didn't come out exactly what I was envisioning, but they rarely do. And chances are eventually it'll end up being better than how I pictured it. You know, these don't look like a whole lot right now just because they are more for backgrounds that I do other things on top of. Here's that, I guess it's a charmeuse or something with the black on it, but you can see how transparent it is. And for instance, on something, another piece, how I can take a strip of these little black dots, which I don't know if that shows up on camera, how kind of variegated they are, but that can lay on top of something and still have some of that color showing through. And that's what I love about it. Or on like this one, you can add over the top of something else. Here's our little flowers. And again, I'll be adding some more stuff to these to turn them into looking more like flowers. The foam brush, this is one of my favorites for creating a really cool background. Oftentimes I'll cut it into narrower strips to use on a collage piece. But that's one of my favorites I've used quite frequently. This is going to be for a small quilt background. And this is exactly the kind of way I wanted it to look. Now I may add some other layers on top of this to give it a little bit more texture when I actually do the project with it. There's our squish and spread, I think is what I've called it. And then the ones where we have painted using the friction erasable pen so that it marks it on there. But then when you heat set it, it goes away. So that by doing on transparent fabrics too, it can give you some opportunity for doing some layering. And then the one that was just on the muslin, but how the pen is just gone. And then last but not least, these little guys. Doesn't really show up. I have a piece of black here, so let me show these on the black. And then you can see how that copper, whoops, it kind of now looks like metallic mesh when you put it on the black with when I use some turquoise and green on it to give it that corroded kind of look. And then I have this assortment of threads that as they dry, then you can kind of pull them apart and use bits and pieces. But by painting them with some of your leftover paint, like I say, I don't throw much away because you never know when you may want that in there for some sort of collage. Anyway, that's some fun techniques for doing dry paint or paint on dry fabric. And so the next video is going to be using wet fabric, and you're going to get much more watercolor effects for that. So thanks a bunch.